நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
I'm sitting on the front doorstep of a house that Annamalai Swami built sometime after he left Ramanashram in 1938. Before we go inside and have a look, I just need to recap a few details of what happened to him in Ramanashram and how he ended up in this particular place. So Annamalai Swami first came to Bhagavan in early 1929. He had a spell of working as Bhagavan's attendant, and then Bhagavan selected him and said, "You will build all the ashram buildings under my supervision." So over the next 10 years, all of the big granite solid buildings in the ashram were constructed by Annamalai Swami, two plans that were personally drawn up by Bhagavan, and the work itself, though executed by Annamalai Swami, was done under Bhagavan's direct supervision. Bhagavan set him a very grueling schedule. Annamalai Swami said, "I don't think I sat down for 10 years. He said, if Bhagavan ever saw me sitting and meditating, he would just invent some new job for me to do. He just kept me continuously busy for 10 years.
Namo Ramanaya nalam pera vaalga, vimochanameyyan virai.
I'm standing in front of a very old feature of Ramanashram, which has been here since about 1930. I'm on a bench midway between Lakshmi's Samadhi and a new extension to the dining room. This was Annamalai Swami's first big building job, commissioned by Bhagavan somewhere around 1930. Up till that point, every winter the ashram would get flooded. Water would come down from a stream on the slopes of Arunachala. It would gush across the ashram and leave a trail of destruction wherever it went. Bhagavan decided something had to be done about this, so he commissioned Annamalai Swami to build this particular structure. It's not as big as it was when he built it, because the land in front has been raised several feet. I think in its prime it was probably about 8 feet high and probably about 12 feet across at the top. When Annamalai Swami started building this, it was such a huge structure that people would come and laugh and say, "Are you building a railway embankment? What's this for?" And Annamalai Swami, even at that early stage, he said, "I'm following Bhagavan's orders. Bhagavan has given me instructions. These are his instructions. It's my job to carry them out, not to decide it's too big or too small." So progressively, probably over a few weeks, he built this massive earth structure, and he faced it with granite on either side. Now, I talked to Annamalai Swami in the 1980s, and he probably knew about 15 words of English, probably. That might be an overestimate, but one of them was revêtement, and that's such a ridiculously obscure word, even in English. I had to go home and look it up. In English, a revêtement is a huge earth mound which is supported and reinforced by stone facing on either side. He said he was told at the time that the correct technical term for this structure was a revêtement, and 50 years later that was one of the 15 English words that he knew. The wall was a great success, and there were no more floods here at Ramanashram until in the 1990s Sri Ramanashram decided that the old dining room was not big enough for all the guests who were coming. So they extended it backwards and created a much bigger building, and to do that they had to knock a big hole in the revêtement Bhagavan had commissioned and had built 50, 60 years before. And I sat there thinking, there's going to be a flood. Bhagavan knew what he was talking about. And all the engineers said, no, we know what we're doing. We've taken care of this. Trust us. There won't be any floods. And then the following November, through this gap between the end of Bhagavan's protecting wall and the new dining room, a great torrent, a cascade of water came flowing in, flooded the whole ashram. and Bhagavan's Samadhi hall ended up being 18 inches deep in muddy water, and they had to pump it out. So Bhagavan definitely knew what he was doing, and when he built this wall in 1930, it was for the sole purpose of preventing the ashram from experiencing annual floods.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazha Vimochanameyyan Virai.
After all of the big buildings in the ashram, except for one, had been constructed, Annamalai Swami said, I was in Bhagavan's bathroom with one other attendant, and the other attendant, out of curiosity, said, Bhagavan, these sadhus who smoke ganja, that's cannabis, they seem to get very blissful. What is the relationship between the bliss that the sadhus experience from smoking ganja and the bliss that comes from spiritual practice? So instead of giving a direct answer, Bhagavan imitated a stone sadhu. He goes, Ananda, Ananda, Ananda being the word for bliss. So he put on a performance of being a completely stoned sadhu, staggering around his bathroom until he got in front of Annamalai Swami, at which point his outstretched arms reached round Annamalai Swami and he gave him a hug, and Annamalai Swami said, instantly I went into samadhi. I completely lost my body consciousness, there was no awareness of the world. I was completely rooted to the spot. At some point later that morning, I became aware of my body, the world, the surroundings. Bhagavan had gone, the other attendant had gone. And he said there was something climactic about this particular experience. He knew that although he had spent 10 years working every day for Bhagavan, under Bhagavan's supervision, he knew that particular chapter of his life had come to an end. He realized that from that moment on, he was going to sit and meditate in Palakottu and try and put Bhagavan's teachings into practice. He knew, of course, that to do this he had to go and see Bhagavan, explain what he wanted to do and get his approval, but somehow inside he knew that this was the next phase of his life. So he found Bhagavan, explained what had happened, and he said, I want to go and meditate in Palakottu, may I have your permission? Bhagavan knew, I think, this was coming. I think he gave him the experience in order to push him off in that direction. Bhagavan was very happy with this. He said, yes, you go and meditate. So when Annamalai Swami got up that morning, he was a full-time, more than full-time. He had a job and a half working for Ramanashram, looking after all their building work. And just in the space of half an hour, all that finished. He took his keys to the ashram manager, Chinnaswami, said, I'm resigning, here are all my keys, I'm off to Palakottu. Everyone was completely astounded because he'd never discussed this. This was just something precipitated by this direct experience in the bathroom. Everyone, of course, said, but how are you going to support yourself? This was a man who had no money, no sponsors, no means of supporting himself. He just said, I don't know, not my business. I'm going to Palakottu, that decision has been taken, Bhagavan has approved, I'm leaving. So he started walking to Palakottu. He didn't have a job, he didn't have any money, he didn't have anywhere to stay that night. And as he was walking, he bumped into Managala Venkatramaya. We've already discussed him outside. He was the person who compiled talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. He had a hut here. So he told Managala, I've just decided to leave the ashram. I'm going to live in Palakottu. Managala said, oh, that's great. I've been called back to Bombay on urgent business. Here's the key to my house. You can go and stay in my house till I come back. So that solved his immediate problems. Then one of his close friends in the ashram, Major Chadwick, heard that he'd moved to Palakottu, that he didn't have any means to support himself. So he arranged for someone to come every day, cook lunch for Annamalai Swami. So just a combination of circumstances. He got the experience from Bhagavan in the morning. An hour later, he'd handed in his own keys. He'd collected his key to this hut in Palakottu. And by lunchtime, one of his oldest friends in the ashram had arranged for him to be fed. So this situation continued for a while. And then Annamalai Swami was standing, probably quite close to where I'm sitting right now, with a devotee who he had used to build some of the ashram buildings, called Aramagam. So they weren't talking about building Annamalai Swami a house, they were just standing, having a casual chat, more or less where I'm right now. Bhagavan came by on his morning walk to Palakottu, saw Annamalai Swami, who was the ashram builder, talking to Aramagam, who was one of the main masons. And I think possibly in a joking way, he said to Aramagam, "Oh, are you going to build Annamalai Swami a house?" Which of course he wasn't planning to do. And Aramagam said, it was as if I had no choice or decision over what I said. He said, "Yes, I'm going to build Annamalai Swami a house." And Annamalai Swami looked at him and thought, "Well, that's news to me." And then Bhagavan said, "Oh, make sure you build him a good one, build him a nice big house." So suddenly Aramagam felt compelled to carry out his obligation that Bhagavan had come. He'd made this promise in front of Bhagavan he was going to build a house, and he didn't have any money, Annamalai Swami didn't have any money. What they had was Bhagavan suggesting that a house be built, and Aramagam, for no reason whatsoever, blurting out, "Yes, I will build a house." So when things like this happen, when Bhagavan has pushed events in a particular way, they always have a habit of working out in a good way. And as it turned out, money came from unexpected sources, a building started, and one of my favorite, it's a long, complicated story, but one of my favorite bits of the story was when Bhagavan came one day and the foundations had been dug for the building, and what they had was a gigantic hole full of boulders. And Bhagavan looked and got very excited and said, "Oh, you found buried treasure." And they all looked at this pile of boulders and thought, "What's he talking about?" And this was Bhagavan, as usual, being not wasteful of available resources. He said, "Well, what happens when you want to build a house? You dig a hole, then you have to get some big stones for the foundations, then you have to put them on a truck, get them delivered, put them in your hole. Look what's happened here, you've dug yourself a hole and the big foundation stones are already there. There's your buried treasure, this is the foundation you can build your house on." So every day Bhagavan would come, the house would get bigger and bigger. There were a few dramas over finances, how it was going to be finished, but as with all projects that Bhagavan supervised, everything came to a satisfactory conclusion. When the walls were up, Annamalai Swami was deciding what kind of roof he was going to put on, and Bhagavan said, "In my house we used palmyra timbers." Palmyra is the toddy tree, it looks like a coconut tree shape. He said, "That's very strong, it's very useful for making ceiling timbers. That's the kind of roof support we had in our house in Madurai, it worked well for us, you should do the same here." So it's indicative of the kind of hands-on approach that Bhagavan had, that he liked to use cheap, available local materials, but he also had an eye for quality. He wanted jobs to be well done. He wanted materials that were durable, that would last a long time. Now this house was built somewhere around 1938-39. The basic structure that Annamalai Swami and Aramagam put up together in 1938, it's still there, and we can go inside and have a little look at it.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravalga Vimochanameyyan Virai.
This is the room where Annamalai Swami used to meet devotees and talk to them. All the years I used to see him, he would sit on a sofa in the corner, people would sit on the floor in front of him, and he would answer their questions. Now one thing I like about Annamalai Swami, there are lots of things I like about him, is he didn't want to be a guru. He didn't want to sit on a sofa and have people stare at him, meditate in front of him. He used to tell people, if you have a question about Bhagavan, his life or his teachings, or any topic relating to practical advice on meditation, you come, you ask your question, and when you've got your answer, if you want to meditate, go back to Ramana and meditate there. So in a sense, he was never in the guru business. He didn't want people to come, but he did concede that he had a certain knowledge, a certain ability to talk to people, to answer their questions. He had a vast fund of information about Bhagavan's life. He understood Bhagavan's teachings very well. And he was an outstanding teacher, I have to say this. This is a man who was sent to school by his father when he was 5 years old, and his dad said, learn how to sign your name. He said, that's the only thing that school is useful for. When you've learned how to sign your name, come home and you can work in my fields. So Annamalai Swami's entire education lasted less than 2 weeks, during which he learned the alphabet and learned how to write his name. And then his dad pulled him out of school and set him to work in the family fields. So here was a man with almost no formal education. When he arrived at Ramanashram, he couldn't write, he couldn't do arithmetic. And yet Bhagavan not only made him construct major projects that needed engineering skills, he also made him keep the accounts. And this was a man who'd never even learned basic arithmetic. So he had a very steep learning curve. He had some help, but Bhagavan refused to subcontract those jobs to anybody else. He just told Annamalai Swami, get on with it, you learn these skills, you're the man I want to do this. So what I was really going to say was, here is a man who didn't talk from book knowledge. He didn't talk from information he'd got from anything else except what Bhagavan had told him and what he discovered himself through his own spiritual practice. So to come and see him was to get, in a way, is to get very raw, uncompromising teachings directly from the source. What I liked about him, he was very shy and withdrawn. I just want to demonstrate how Annamalai Swami was when you came to see him. He would sit on his sofa, and there was something physically closed about him. He'd be a little bit hunched up, and then he wouldn't be looking at you. And then you'd say, Swami, how do I do self-inquiry? And he'd start blah, 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 blah. He'd start muttering. And if he liked what you were saying, if he thought you were asking interesting questions, useful questions, and that you were listening to his answers, like his head would slowly come up. And it was like a flower opening. The more he realized that you appreciated what he had to say, the louder his voice would get, the more animated he would get. He would expand. His whole body would open up. His smile would come on his face, and by 10 or 15 minutes into the conversation, if you were on his wavelength, if you were talking about sadhana, Bhagavan, practice, the only thing that really appealed to him anyway, these were the topics he wanted to talk about, then he'd be full on. He'd be totally animated, totally talkative, and you had a great time with him. But somehow, if you weren't talking about things that interested him, he'd kind of stay in this little kind of hunched up mode. And this was interesting because there was an old devotee of Bhagavan called G.V. Subramaya, and he wrote an account of how Ramana Maharshi, to some extent, was the same. He said Bhagavan would sit on his sofa, and he said it was a skilled art getting an answer from Bhagavan. You had to be very brief, you had to be to the point, you didn't need to ramble, and most of all, don't interrupt when he started speaking. So he said people would come, and if they knew the technique, they would address a question to Bhagavan, and Bhagavan might look initially as if he hadn't noticed you, listened to you, had no intention of replying to you. But G.V. Subramaya said, don't be tempted to repeat your question or prompt him. He said, just sit there, be quiet. He's listened to you, he's heard you. There's some response is kind of bubbling up. And he said, then Bhagavan would start talking. He would be quiet, he'd be slow, possibly a little hesitant. And if he could see that you were interested and that no one was interrupting him, his speed would increase, he would get more and more animated. If he was telling stories about the gods or the saints, he'd start acting out the part of all the people in the stories. And he said the one thing you absolutely never could do was say, but Bhagavan, what about this? Or, this doesn't make sense. And then he'd go back into his shell again. So it was a question of giving one simple question that would trigger a response, waiting for the question to sink in, and then Bhagavan would suddenly bloom. He'd get into this incredibly animated mode. And what G.V. Subramaya said was that you have to understand that Bhagavan wasn't talking from a mind to a mind. When you asked these very short, terse questions, you were somehow triggering the self. You were triggering Brahman to give a response. And if you could sit quietly, you could sit patiently, then God himself, then Brahman himself would get more and more voluble, and you'd get this exceptional answer. And he said the trick was, don't interrupt. Don't assume he hasn't heard. Just sit there and wait for the whole unfolding process to happen. And I saw that to some extent with Annamalai Swami. He would start in this little like a little hunched up old man sitting on a bench, and if somehow he felt you were talking about the things that he cared about, slowly, everything would open up and you'd have a great conversation with him.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravarga Vimochanameyyan Viraima.
I'm sitting on the parapet wall above Annamalai Swami's ashram, overlooking Palakottu in the background, because I want to tell a story about a devotee of Bhagavan called Lakshman Sarma. He lived in Palakottu, which is why we're up here talking about him. I'm not quite sure where on this row of buildings he actually lived, but I do know that from about 1938 onwards he was living somewhere on this block. Now, Lakshman Sarma came from a Tamil town called Pudukkottai, and he was a lawyer by profession. He had learned Sanskrit, he knew Vedanta, and he was with Bhagavan about 1928 when Bhagavan turned to him and said, "Have you read or studied Aladu Napadu?" This is Bhagavan's 40-verse compilation that is the distillation of all his Advaitic philosophical ideas. Lakshman Sarma said, no Bhagavan, the Tamil is too difficult for me. Now this might seem a little bit odd. Here was a man who was an expert Vedantic scholar. He knew Sanskrit, Tamil was his native language, Bhagavan was his guru, and here he was saying, sorry, it's too complicated. The reason for this is that Tamil has a written form, a poetical form, which is quite different from the everyday Tamil that people speak on the street or even what they read in their newspapers. It's a very high-class literary form which has been used down the centuries to express the highest ideas of religious and philosophical thought, and unless you've undergone a special training, then it's very difficult even for a native speaker to understand exactly what spiritual or philosophical works mean. I think Bhagavan knew that he hadn't had this training, so he said, you come to me, I will teach you what these verses mean. Now this was, I would say, almost unique, that Bhagavan picked out a person who seemingly didn't have a particular qualification in the language, offered to teach the essence of his teachings to this person on a verse-by-verse basis, and gave him private lessons every day. He was always willing to explain what a particular verse meant if you asked him in public in the hall, but to have him identify one particular devotee and say, come to me every day for private lessons, I will tell you exactly what my written teachings mean, this was quite unique. So from that day on, Lakshman Sarma went to him every day. Bhagavan would explain the intricacies of literary Tamil. He would explain what all the words meant, how the grammar tied it all together. And this was a proper study program, because at the end of every explanation, Bhagavan would send Lakshman Sarma off and say, go home, your homework is to come back tomorrow morning with a perfect Sanskrit translation of the verse. I want to see that you've understood what I'm saying, and the way I can tell that is if you go away, think about what I've said, convey exactly what I've said, nothing more, nothing less, in a perfect Sanskrit verse. That's your homework assignment. Go away, make a Sanskrit verse, come back tomorrow with your verse. So Lakshman Sarma would go away. He knew enough Sanskrit to convey the philosophical subtleties, but Bhagavan was hardly ever satisfied with the versions he came back with. This was a very strict study course that Bhagavan conducted, one-on-one. Lakshman Sharma would bring a verse back. Bhagavan would say, no, you haven't understood this point, or you haven't explained that point properly. Go back, do it again. So Lakshman Sharma has written that each verse took 2, 3, 4, 5 different renderings by him in Sanskrit until Bhagavan was satisfied that he had properly understood what the teachings were and that he'd adequately rendered them into Sanskrit, and then they would move on to the next verse. So verse by verse, there are 40 in all, plus 2 benedictory verses. He got to the end of the 42nd verse, and at that point a devotee of Ganapati Muni came to the ashram and he went through them. Now Ganapati Muni was an absolutely outstanding Sanskrit poet, but he didn't really accept a lot of Bhagavan's teachings on Advaita. He belonged to a different philosophical school, as did this man Kapali Sastri, who went through the work that Bhagavan had showed him. So Kapali Sastri said, why don't I send this to Ganapati Muni? He's much better at Sanskrit than all of us. He can polish it up and send it back. Okay, says Bhagavan. Okay, says Lakshman Sharma. So the verse went off to Ganapati Muni, who looked at these verses, and I'm not saying he cheated a little bit, but what he did was translate them into Sanskrit in a much shorter meter than the text warranted. So this meant that in every verse he had the possibility of leaving things out that he didn't fully agree with. So by sending back a version that was in a slightly shorter meter, he could somehow dilute the full Advaitic message that Bhagavan was trying to give out. Now, Lakshman Sharma, he wasn't a brilliant Sanskrit scholar. He realized that the version Ganapati Muni sent back was much more fluent, much more poetic, much more polished, much more literary. So he said, oh, this is great, I'll use this for my Parayana. Parayana is chanting of scriptural works. Bhagavan, on the other hand, immediately saw what had happened. He gave Ganapati Muni's version back to Lakshman Sharma and said, start all over again. We're going back to verse 1. I want you to retranslate the whole work, and this time I want you to choose a much longer meter than the version you did last time, because I don't want there to be any doubt about what my teachings actually are. So the whole study program started from scratch again. Lakshman Sharma came, they went back to verse 1, verse 2, in a wholly different meter. Every day Lakshmana Sharma would turn up with his Sanskrit homework. Most days Bhagavan would send him back and say, do it again. And eventually they arrived at a mutually acceptable new 42-verse translation of this work, which Bhagavan was happy was a proper translation and was a fully acceptable rendering of his principal ideas.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravartha Vimochanamayan Virai.
At that point, Lakshman Sharma started to write Tamil commentaries on these verses. He'd had these private instructions from Bhagavan, he'd had the study course. He'd twice translated the whole work, once in a short meter, once in a much longer meter. So he was, without doubt, probably the most qualified person at that time to write down in Tamil what Bhagavan thought his principal philosophical work meant. So he started to write a Tamil commentary, 1 verse per week, and he sent them off to a Tamil magazine which serialized this particular commentary. Every week a copy of this magazine would come to Ramanashram. Bhagavan would cut out the portion where Lakshman Sharma's commentary had been printed, and he would paste it in a scrapbook, so that by the time all 42 verses had been published, the scrapbook contained a homemade book of all of Lakshman Sharma's explanations. And then if anybody came and said, Bhagavan, what does verse 13 mean, or what does verse 23 mean, as often as not, he would hand over the scrapbook and say, read this. So this quite clearly was Bhagavan's preferred interpretation. There are many ways of interpreting some of these verses, which he personally selected Lakshman Sharma to give. Lakshman Sharma did the translation, he then did the commentary. It was published in Tamil, and Bhagavan used this as a kind of source reference book for anyone who came to the hall and said, please tell me what this particular verse means. Now, at that point, or somewhere around this point, Lakshman Sharma and Chinnaswami had some kind of disagreement. About what, I have no idea. I suspect it was probably about Lakshman Sharma publishing works on Bhagavan or about Bhagavan privately. Chinnaswami was a bit of a monopolist. He didn't like works on Bhagavan being out of his control, so he tended to have quarrels with just about everyone who wrote books in those days, and he had the ultimate sanction. If he didn't like what you were doing, he could stop you coming inside the ashram, and that for most people meant losing access to Bhagavan. So Lakshman Sharma was ultimately asked to leave, and he ended up living in a house here in Palakottu, and every day Bhagavan would come and they'd chat here. And this was the community, as well as the community of sadhus who didn't want to work in the ashram, this was the community of exiles who, for one reason or another, had been cast out of Ramana Ashram and weren't allowed to come and see Bhagavan in the hall. He would come here and see them himself. Now, Bhagavan almost never interfered in what his brother did apropos management of Ramana Ashram. He let him run the accommodation, he let him decide who could eat there. But the next story, I prefaced the next story with that because this was quite an exceptional intervention by Bhagavan, that Lakshman Sharma privately published his Tamil commentary. This was probably the reason Chinnaswami was upset, and it wasn't on sale in Ramanashram because Chinnaswami didn't like outside publications. The only copy on sale was a version by Ganapati Muni, which, as I explained before, he had his own understanding of what the verses meant, and the ashram was selling that one. So Bhagavan went to the ashram office to talk to Chinnaswami. Now this was such a rare event. In fact, it's almost unheard of that Bhagavan went to the office for anything. If he had any business with Chinnaswami, somebody would send a message and Chinnaswami would come and see him. The fact that Bhagavan himself went to the office meant he personally had something very important to say, and he stood outside the window. He was too polite to go in. The office wasn't his domain, that wasn't his business. So he just stood outside, kind of peering in, hoping somebody would notice him. And finally, one of the underlings in the office kind of spotted Bhagavan, called to Chinnaswami and said, look, Bhagavan's there, let's go and see what he wants. So Chinnaswami came out and Bhagavan said, everybody is saying that Lakshman Sharma's book on Oladu Narpadu is the best commentary. Why aren't we selling it? I mean, you can't get more direct than this. So Chinnaswami took the hint. He bought up all of Lakshman Sharma's unsold copies. He made himself a little sticker that said Ramanashram and pasted that sticker over Lakshman Sharma's original publishing address. And from that moment on, the book has always been an ashram publication. A nice, long, interesting story. But as a comment on this, I want to say that Bhagavan took his teachings very seriously with some people. With some people, he didn't care what they said about him, if they wanted to misrepresent him, if they had strange ideas about what his teachings were. But there are a few rare examples, and this is one of them, of him deciding, I want my teachings to come out in a correct, properly explained form. I'm going to pick the person who does this, I'm going to supervise their work, and I'm going to make sure this work is available once it's finished. This is, I would say, in a very, very small category of books that Bhagavan initiated the project himself, gave private lessons, supervised the study, supervised the writing of the book, checked it, and then insisted that the ashram sell this particular publication. I just say this because there are a lot of books that came out even during Bhagavan's lifetime that contain ideas which are quite alien to Bhagavan's, which were not shown to Bhagavan by the people who wrote them, and which quite clearly don't represent Bhagavan's teachings. He tolerated anybody saying anything about him. He tolerated anybody who had a different understanding of his teachings. He had no objection if people wrote a book completely misrepresenting his teachings. And he didn't even object when those books went on sale in the ashram bookstore. But once in a while, I think just to establish what those teachings really were, he would pick out someone like Lakshman Sharma and say, right, we're starting from scratch, line 1, verse 1, I'm going to give you an absolutely accurate explanation of what every single syllable means. You're going to write it down, you're going to write this commentary, and this is what I'm going to show people when they come along and say, Bhagavan, what are your teachings?
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazha Vimochanamaiyan Virai Malakkal Vazha.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazha Vimochanamaiyan Virai Malakkal Vazha. Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazha Vimochanamaiyan Virai Malakkal Vazha. அடிமுடிக்குண்டாய அநாதித் தொடர்பின் விடமுடியாமை மறந்து விட்டு